He appeared on the eastern edge of the marketplace at sunset when crimson light poured through the arches, casting distorted shadows on the worn wooden stalls. No one knew his name or what his modest arrival might bring. People were routinely folding up their stalls, hiding away their wares, and only two guards, leaning nonchalantly on their spears at the square's entrance, gave him a fleeting glance. Had anyone known that this figure in a simple cloak would soon become key to the coming changes, they might have looked more closely. He seemed to dissolve into the dense twilight among the closed shops, where the air smelled of wilted greens and spices long gone stale. In this part of the city, silence held sway. Somewhere, the voice of a street musician, playing a mournful tune on an old pipe, could be heard. Far off, two people shouted, arguing over the price of flour, and then someone's slow footsteps sounded close by but soon died away, giving way to the soft breath of the evening wind. At moments like these, the city, usually bustling, felt as if it were hiding in its own winding streets. He walked unhurriedly, as though savoring each step. His heavy boots touched the paving stones almost soundlessly, while some quiet resolve grew in his soul. He made his way to a quiet tavern near the city walls, their thickness a testament to construction that predated the city's rapid growth. At the door he was met by the faint glow of a lantern barely warding off the dusk. From inside came the muted hum of conversation and the smell of fried onions. The warped door creaked, letting the stranger into the tavern's warm half-light. Inside sat a motley assortment of travelers, two locals, and a pair of humanoid creatures conversing excitedly in an unknown tongue. The tavern's owner, a short, gruff old man, gave him a brief nod in greeting. The newcomer answered with a short bow before settling at the far table. He projected fatigue, yet also a curious sense of calm. His cloak was sturdy but dusty, perhaps he'd been traveling on foot for days. Beneath it was a simple tunic, and at his belt a worn dagger in its sheath. His face was hidden by a half-lowered hood, and only when the tavern keeper brought him a mug of ale could one see his dull, almost faded eyes, reflecting some long-ago sorrow. He thanked the owner, took a few sips, and, once the old man had walked away, closed his eyes for a moment as if listening to something within himself. At a nearby table sat three people, a broad-shouldered man with a scar on his chin, a lanky youth with a mischievous grin, and a tall woman whose face remained in shadow, dimly lit by a weak lamp above. They exchanged glances when the newcomer entered but asked no questions. It was a place where no one inquired too deeply, anyone could arrive and stay hidden in the tavern's corners if they wished. Still, a flicker of unease passed between them, cloaked figures appearing at sunset, reluctant to show their faces, seldom promised peaceful times. The wind outside grew stronger. Somewhere far off thunder rumbled, although no clouds were visible. Suddenly, the tavern's hush was broken by the sharp sound of a shattered glass. The woman at the other table jumped up, knocking her chair aside, and grabbed the lanky youth by the front of his shirt. He dropped his half-finished ale and began babbling quickly, trying to defend himself, but from her expression it was clear words would not calm her. The broad-shouldered man wanted to intervene but hesitated. The stranger in the cloak briefly lifted his head. His eyes gleamed slightly in the lamp's glow, and one might think he was deciding whether to interfere or if the scene left him unmoved. At length, he slowly lowered his head again, taking another sip of ale, letting the confrontation play out. The woman suddenly shoved the youth so hard that he flew back against the wall and slid to the floor, clutching his side. A cry rang out, the tavern patrons muttered in concern, even the owner came rushing over to see what was happening. But the stranger did not move. Out of the corner of his eye, he saw the youth get to his feet, eyes full of desperation, a slender blade in hand, while the woman, breathing heavily, continued to pierce him with her gaze from the shadows. The air reeked of imminent bloodshed, yet something held them back from the killing blow, as if they feared the presence of some higher power witnessing their every move. The tension in the tavern was almost palpable, as if the air had turned thick. At last, the broad-shouldered man took a decisive step between them, glanced first at the youth, then at the woman, and croaked, "Remember the oath." Both froze, like a pair of wound-up mechanisms abruptly halted. In the words "remember the oath" lay a strange solemnity that would not allow a fight under these rafters. At those words, some kind of code phrase, the woman lowered her hands and the youth sheathed his blade. Only then did the stranger in the cloak realize these three shared a secret, bound by a powerful vow. Still quietly seated, he kept his eyes on them. With a sigh of relief, the owner returned to the bar, grumbling under his breath about strange folk always turning up here. The group at the other table fell into a sullen silence. At last the woman sat down again, leaning forward and sinking her fingers into her intricately braided hair. The broad-shouldered man muttered that they needed to talk outside, so all three left through the tavern's back door. The stranger finished his ale, set 2 coins down, and made his way out. It was as if the near bloody clash had cemented his determination. Stepping out into the night, he merged with the sounds of the wind and the faint jingle of signs swaying above worn-out storefronts. Narrow lanes ran alongside a massive stone wall, above which the outlines of mountains could be glimpsed. The city was built on multiple levels. The lower quarters lay in darkness, while the upper, wealthier areas shone brightly with torches and hovering magical orbs above their squares. From high above came the din of nighttime festivities and the subdued music of palace salons. But our story's protagonist was not heading for the grand gates. Skirting old warehouses, he slipped through a narrow walkway reeking of refuse and stagnant water. More than once, he skirted shadowy figures huddled at the walls with gnarled hands held out for alms. Some slept, wrapped in old sacks. Down here, beneath the city's main thoroughfares, gloom and neglect reigned, while up above, important matters were being decided. Each saw only their own world, cordoned off from the rest by the maze of streets and the city's unyielding stairways. But he knew his destination. He walked as if guided by an inner call, and when he reached a blank brick wall, which in the twilight revealed itself as an abandoned temple, he withdrew a tiny figurine from a concealed pocket and pressed some part of it. A soft grinding came from inside the wall, and a rectangular opening swung back to let him in. A stale smell clung to the cramped chamber within. The walls were clammy to the touch, lit only by the faint blue glow of a tiny crystal in his hand. This old temple had long been considered deserted. Its statues and stained glass windows were gone, and locals claimed only rats and ghosts inhabited it now. The guard patrols tended to avoid the site. The townspeople preferred not to remember it was ever there. Yet some still knew secret ways to hidden halls. The flagstones creaked underfoot, and the echoes of his footsteps stretched out like an endless train of shadows. From time to time, the stranger peered into side corridors, only to see collapsed arches and lifeless columns coated in dust from countless years. At last, he entered a spacious hall. The sound of his steps changed, it echoed more distinctly, and the glow of his crystal revealed a ring of columns rising in the center. Beyond them, on a partly ruined altar, stood a slab of black marble. As he drew closer, running a hand across the uneven surface, he heard a soft rustling. From behind one of the columns emerged a figure in long, midnight blue robes. Its eyes glimmered like mirrors, and its hands remained hidden in roomy sleeves. There were no obvious emblems on the robe, save for a small embroidered spiral that was barely visible up close. This figure studied the newcomer in silence. He stood motionless as well. Their wordless meeting lasted several long seconds, and then the figure gave a small nod, seeming to acknowledge the stranger's right to be there. They walked around the altar and stopped at a mosaic on the floor, barely discernible in the dimness. It depicted a mysterious design, reminiscent of intertwining roads or rivers, a map, perhaps, or a cryptic symbol. The robed figure touched the stone with delicate fingers, and a faint ripple of bluish sparks suddenly flared. Light traveled along the channels in the design, as though breathing life into an ancient ritual. The stranger crouched, running his palm along the same lines, and under his touch the sparks intensified. He closed his eyes, listening for the barely detectable sound, maybe the pulse of the earth's depths, maybe the echo of distant footsteps on stone corridors. The air grew dense, filled with the sense of hidden power. At last he raised his head, and his eyes glowed in an uncanny way. He spoke several unclear words, which sounded like a whispered wind rustling through old forest canopies. The robed figure murmured a brief phrase in the same language, then silence fell for a few seconds. It seemed both were measuring their thoughts against some unseen source of knowledge. When they spoke again, their voices were sharper, like echoes of those sparks dancing over the mosaic. Their speech, though unintelligible, signified mutual understanding, a confirmation of some shared pact. Then the glow began to fade, and the pattern on the floor died away. The stranger stood, and the robed figure did likewise, revealing it was not quite as tall as one might have thought. Yet within the hands hidden in those wide sleeves lay a potent energy no cloth could fully conceal. It felt as if the figure could command the stones or whip the very air into a vortex at will. Still, it did nothing, merely watched as the stranger headed for the exit. He knew their conversation was only the beginning of a complicated path that had brought him to the city. Whatever was spoken in the gloom of that forsaken temple was linked to a secret that would transform the fate of the kingdom. He felt a surge of energy but also the weight of responsibility. When he returned to the street, darkness had deepened further and the sparse torches barely lit the cramped alleys. Far off, a bell tolled midnight. He quietly passed back through the deserted marketplace, which only hours earlier had teemed with life. Now it lay abandoned, with nothing but scraps of cloth scattered about and ropes swaying forlornly in the wind. No one noticed as he again slipped into the labyrinth of streets. Before long, he arrived at a small potion shop, shut for the night, and deftly picked the lock in near silence. The stale aroma of herbs and lingering incense filled the interior. The pounding of his own heart was the only sound disturbing the complete hush. Grabbing a few vials from the shelves, he quickly leafed through a dog-eared register on the counter, then departed without leaving any sign of his intrusion. One might have supposed he was preparing for some dire deed, given his choice of potions, rare ingredients used in arcane rites. Without pause, he made his way to the western quarter of the city, where massive towers and the nobility's grand houses began. Yet before the upper watchman could spot him, he slipped under a half-lowered gate in a side alley. There, in a long-abandoned cellar, an old acquaintance awaited him, a man with a menacing scar across his face, a bandana, and a gaze brimming with resentment at the world. Their conversation was brief, a couple of hushed remarks, and then the man pointed to a wooden chest along the wall. The newcomer lifted the lid and found what he was looking for, a long woven ribbon bearing strange patterns in golden thread, and a copper item shaped like a horn. Through a gap in the metal, one could see runic symbols. The man muttered a warning in a gravelly voice about the object's danger, but the stranger merely nodded and carefully packed the horn and ribbon into his satchel. They parted with few words, and the stranger once again slipped into the night. The towers and walls seemed to press down on him, yet he moved with certainty, as though well acquainted with every back street. When a faint crescent moon emerged, he arrived at a half-filled well with an iron grill. Cautiously sliding one bar aside, he climbed down into the sewage tunnels. There, utter stillness reigned, occasionally interrupted by dripping water. A tangled web of brick passages, some collapsed, some frequented by smugglers or refugees from the city's laws, lay hidden beneath the streets. His goal was a secret room rumored to contain ancient scrolls. Legend had it they held the clue to lifting the dread curse looming over the realm. Walking through the darkness, he caught distant gusts of wind and the lapping of waves against the fortress walls. It was as if nature herself heralded an approaching storm. The night sky was congested with storm clouds, and although lightning had yet to strike, a tension was palpable. Deep in his heart, he knew he wasn't alone in seeking this trove. Others might try to use these ancient scrolls to wield unimaginable power or destroy anyone who stood in their path. He understood the need for haste. A tunnel led him to a heavy door decorated with vine motifs. Its hinges were nearly rusted through, but the lock still held. He took a small steel tool, ran it along the door seam, and heard the bolt click open. Beyond lay a circular chamber that had perhaps once been a monastery's storehouse or a research center. Dusty stone floors were strewn with fragments of frescoes. In one corner rose a rusting contraption of chains and wheels whose purpose was unclear. A clay amphora protruded from a mound of rubble. In the center, a stone dais gaped like a coffin or trough. The walls showed the faded remains of paintings, figures in long cloaks, flickering torchlight, and cryptic symbols set against a shadowy forest. Presumably, rituals once took place here but had long since been forgotten. The stranger slowly circled the chamber, scrutinizing everything. At last he noticed a narrow slot in the wall into which he could fit his hand. Feeling for a hidden lever, he pulled, and one of the panels shifted back, revealing a secret cache. Inside lay a bundle of rough cloth and 3 small scrolls stacked atop each other. Carefully, he opened one scroll to find a series of ancient characters, interspersed with strange diagrams. He recalled something similar from his time studying with northern hermits. He realized these symbols might unlock a colossal mystery or an unimaginable disaster. It would all depend on whose hands they fell into. Distant thunder rumbled, and the air around him began to quiver. It seemed the ground trembled, the canal water trembling in response. Perhaps it was just a laden wagon passing overhead, or maybe a warning of impending catastrophe. In any case, he didn't linger. Hiding the scrolls, he slipped back into the passage he'd come from, once again letting the tunnels engulf him like a night sea. His ascent to the surface was long, forcing him to clamber through cramped ducts and climb over fallen beams. Several times he froze at the sound of human voices, remaining in the shadows until they passed. At length he emerged onto a rickety stairway that led to a small door, which opened onto a forgotten courtyard in the city's depths, overgrown with weeds and devoid of lamplight. Lightning illuminated the wet stone walls, glinting off raindrops. The storm had arrived at last. The first heavy drops fell on the ground, and the air filled with the scent of damp earth and ozone. He realized he stood at the point of no return. Every artifact and scrap of knowledge pointed to a looming moment when he would have to reveal his true identity and purpose. What had begun as destiny's quiet whisper was now growing louder. In the distance, lights flickered among the city's quarters. Apparently someone in the upper district had noticed something amiss or sensed the power of ancient forces. The watchtowers were likely on alert. An army camped on the nearby plateau could be deployed at any moment. But he did not fear them. His truest fear lay in what might awaken within the kingdom itself if ancient magic slipped out of control. A lightning bolt lit up the sky in a diagonal slash. Thunder crashed, and the rain lashed the city with its full ferocity. He raised his hood, examining the walls that barred access to the upper city. Once, before the curse destabilized the balance of powers, these gates had been protected by wards. Now, all that remained were faint, worn sigils. Yet even so, the gates were said to be formidable. Few could pass if evil dwelled in their hearts, perhaps because devout priests once maintained ceaseless incantations. However, with the city mired in intrigues and many priests dead or fallen to corruption, such wards had weakened. He halted before the gate, where sheets of rain pummeled his cloak and rivulets ran down his face. Beyond, voices and the clank of metal rang out, likely a patrol. He had to decide, attempt a stealthy approach or risk revealing his credentials if caught. Above, magical lights burned, revealing the silhouettes of guards. He knew he couldn't face an entire garrison alone, nor could he turn back. The clock was ticking. Each moment of downpour made the street slicker, turning it into a perilous flood. Footsteps sounded, followed by muffled shouts. It seemed someone had noticed movement by the gate. Lightning flashed, illuminating the scene. Several guards rushed forward, brandishing spears in his direction. In the same instant, the wall beside him groaned, and a section of masonry slid aside, offering a slim gap of light. Without hesitation he dove through, hearing the guards hollering orders behind him. With a crash, the stone block dropped back into place, sealing the corridor in darkness. Overhead, muffled blows echoed against the stone. The soldiers were desperately searching for a way in. He felt his way up a stone stairwell. The blue crystal that had served him before was almost spent now. He had to conserve its power. As he climbed higher, the air became drier and a faint draft blew from up ahead. This discreet passage might lead to some forgotten tower or an abandoned walkway. Reaching a small landing, he felt his stomach clench at the sight of a metal grate blocking the tunnel, with a narrow corridor beyond, rippling with strange lights. Touching the grate, he sensed a magical current. A barrier, he thought, not a ward that repels evildoers, but one that warps the space around it. Peering through the dim corridor, he made out another person sitting on a stone bench. Hearing the faint stir, the figure lifted his head, revealing a weary, drawn face. A metal plate ringed his neck, some kind of magical restraint. A prisoner, the stranger wondered. The captive seemed to notice him and rose slightly, pressing a hand against the grate, whispering, "I knew someone would come." The words carried a sort of despairing relief. He tried to say more, but a sudden crack resounded overhead, sending bits of masonry raining down and forcing the newcomer to step back. A hidden mechanism engaged, and an extra stone slab slammed down, shutting him out. All he managed to see were the frightened eyes of the prisoner on the far side. The noise from above intensified. Presumably the guards had discovered alternative routes. He had to find a safe place quickly. Spinning around, he spotted a tall recess in the wall. Without delay, he pressed a protrusion and part of the stone slid aside, revealing another pathway. Feeling his way, he rushed forward as the echoes of pursuit loomed behind him. At length, the narrow corridor opened onto a small, dim room perched just under the tower's roof. Through arrow slits, he could see flickers of lightning above the city. The downpour hammered on rooftops, lanes, and courtyards. He approached a slit and gazed out. The storm-shrouded city stretched before him. Down below, flashes of blue flickered, likely the kingdom's mags trying to quell the storm or do battle with an unseen foe. It seemed all hidden powers, dark and light, had awakened. The tumult of rain and thunder mirrored the conflict raging in the streets and far beyond. He felt ancient magic thrumming in his veins, as though the earth itself recognized its bearer of this strange gift. Now he possessed the scrolls, the ritual horn, and the golden ribbon someone had once named the guiding thread of fates. Yet these were but tools. The critical question was how to steer the world's destiny. Those lurking in the temple, who had sworn blood oaths, knew a portion of the truth. The three in the tavern, who had nearly come to blows, might hold another part. Elsewhere in the city's labyrinths wandered others seeking to claim the artifacts or sabotage one another's plans. He looked at the crystal in his hands, its energy almost spent. Beyond, lightning illuminated his profile in sharp relief, a weathered face with a glimmer of sorrowful resolve. In that moment, he realized he would need allies to accomplish his goal alone. Confronting the rising darkness single-handedly would be impossible. He had to return to the heart of the city's intrigue and might have to face old enemies. At the same time, he must avoid those who pursued him. With a sigh, he stepped away from the arrow slit, surveying the room again, wondering if he could climb higher to safely reach the rooftop and descend along the crumbling exterior. That seemed his only option. Hand over hand, he scaled the tower's outer wall, which was slick with rain, using cracks and protrusions as footholds. His arms ached, fingers slipped, and the gale nearly tore him away. But slowly, rock by rock, he made his ascent, finally reaching a narrow ledge overlooking the upper city and the distant hills. Darkness concealed most details, but he could just make out the palace lights. Activity was evident, torches flickered at the gates, silhouettes dashed about, and a horn twice sounded above the howl of the wind. Possibly the king or his council were aware that something extraordinary was unfolding. They were, no doubt, deciding how to respond. He pressed against the wall to remain inconspicuous, pulling out the woven ribbon. Running his fingers along its gilded designs, he tried to recall the exact ritual associated with them. It seemed to hint at a temporal loop, where events echo ancient deeds. The horn beside it held power too, blown at a certain hour, it might awaken forces slumbering in the depths or summon beings from beyond this realm. But its use could come at an unbearable price. Thunder boomed, and the darkness split under the lightning's glare. Feeling an urgent need to move, he edged along the ledge toward a spot where decorative pinnacles and stone gargoyles formed a small alcove, an ideal nook for sheltering from prying eyes. He squeezed into it, laid out the scrolls safely from the rain, and began murmuring ancient words while tracing the runes with his fingertips. His crystal sparked once more before dying, but the ribbon began to give off a faint glow from within. The designs shifted as though reacting to his incantation. Just then, he heard noises below. Guards with torches were surely patrolling the courtyards and rooftops, searching. Their footsteps and low voices echoed in the storm, telling him they were close. It made little sense to reveal himself, and open combat was too risky. He swiftly concealed the scrolls and ribbon, readying himself in case of confrontation. There might be mags among the guards who could sense his presence. Yet the tempest raged on, lightning and torrential rain aiding his concealment. Minutes of tense waiting passed. At one point, someone's step scraped on the stone close by. A thin beam of torchlight slid across the ledge, pausing on a gargoyle statue, but not catching his shape. The guard muttered something, then moved on, unaware that the fugitive was barely 2 steps away. Once the footsteps receded, the stranger exhaled in relief and seized the moment to descend the opposite side. Thus, stealthily, he reached a small alley in the upper city, unlit and deserted. The rain pelted down on the pavement, turning it into a flowing stream, water coursing off his cloak. None of that mattered as long as he remained alive. He stepped onto the stone walkway, pausing to get his bearings. Somewhere in this district was a grand library that once housed ancient chronicles. Perhaps there, at last, he could find details of the ritual he intended to perform. As he pieced the clues together in his mind, he felt the press of time. The enemy would not rest. The greatest dangers still lay ahead. So, heading east toward the old towers flanking the library's entrance, he went. According to legend, a benevolent guild of scholars had once managed this library, but over the years it dissolved, leaving only decay and chaos in the halls. The kingdom's real treasures of knowledge were either buried or destroyed, yet something might remain. Only those holding keys to secret sections could reach their depths. Though it was a long shot, he had no other option. Quickening his pace, he noted his hands trembling, perhaps with cold or with a foreboding sense of what drew near. The night roared on, howling through stony corridors, wind whipping out of the alleys. Lightning flashed more frequently, casting ghostly glows across the city. At every turn among these looming structures, destinies were converging, threads of fate tightening into a single knot. And here was the stranger, haunted by secrecy, striding across rain-slicked cobblestones. He could not predict who else might step onto this stage of shadows, but he knew he must continue forward until the light dispelled the dark, or until the dark swallowed the last glimmer of hope. He walked on and on, never looking back, guided by the silent inner voice that led him into the heart of the storm, unafraid of thunder or lightning. Somewhere beyond that next bend lay a path that others would soon tread as well. None yet knew it. Perhaps someone else had already taken the first step, perhaps they had their own reasons for seeking the ancient secrets. The crucial point was that events were accelerating by the minute. The night itself had become an arena where the looming confrontation's outcome would be decided. Far off, in a future veiled by mist, waited answers and possibly redemption, if only he could withstand every trial without succumbing to the cunning forces swirling in a deadly dance around the kingdom. Night's rain pounded the streets relentlessly, drowning out footsteps and erasing the outlines of shadows. The stranger could no longer tell where the rushing rivulets ended and his thoughts began, so loud was the storm's din. The city seemed lost in a restless dream, roused only by the rumble of thunder. Behind him lay the towers and walls where soldiers searched for him. Ahead rose the road to the ancient library, where he hoped to find answers to his burning questions. He crossed a small stone bridge with curved railings that looked like gnarled beastly claws and emerged into a cramped alley whose walls nearly touched overhead. The rickety porch of one building jutted above the lane, providing a slight overhang against the rain. Under it stood an old woman in a faded headscarf, holding a lantern shielded by her hand. She gazed at his silhouette with a blank expression. What had brought her outside on such a night? Perhaps a missing relative, or fear of thieves, driving her to protect what little she had. Their eyes met, a brief exchange between her faded gaze and his dark, strangely luminous eyes beneath the hood. Both recognized the solitude of their separate paths in this downpour. Then she averted her gaze and slipped back through a creaking door, as if refusing to question fate any further. He pressed on, hugging the walls to hide from the odd patrol that might roam even here, in the city's upper reaches. The rain hampered any pursuit but also weighed heavily on him. His cloak was soaked through, cold settling into his bones, and he had to protect his scrolls and relics. Fortunately, the documents and ritual horn were securely wrapped, and the golden ribbon seemed impervious to water, its pattern still glowed under each lightning flash. At last, he reached a tall black metal fence behind which stood a building of intricate design. Turrets and arched windows, pointed doorways and heavy doors carved with bas-reliefs receded into the gloom, but flashes of lightning revealed the elaborate ornamentation. This was the library, constructed centuries ago, surviving war, dynastic upheaval, and plagues. Every stone radiated the memory of great minds who had shaped history. Even so, the edifice loomed imposingly, as though the sacred powers it once held protected it from ruin. He paused at the wrought iron gate set atop 3 stairs. It appeared locked, though there was no visible padlock, only a delicate spiral etched into the metal. He ran a hand over it, probing for any magical presence. In response, he felt a slight pulse, as if the metal were alive, followed by a sudden chill shooting through his wrist. The seal is active, he realized. I'll have to find another way in or use the ancient unlocking rite. But he only half remembered the ritual from sketches in old manuscripts, and time was running short. Drawing out the golden ribbon, he carefully wound it around his forearm. Its touch upon his skin roused a latent power, the designs gleamed, reflecting the lightning. He pressed his hand to the metal spiral, whispering a few words, phrases he hoped were the proper key. For an instant, nothing happened. Then the spiral trembled and began to unwind, splitting into fine lines. A distant cry, like a bird's call, seemed to echo, and the gate groaned open, allowing him to step inside. He entered the courtyard, sensing a faint vibration from the gate, some remnant of magic or warning that an intruder had crossed the threshold. The square before the library was paved in ancient slabs overgrown at the edges with wild grass. Only the central area around a small, non-functioning fountain had been cleared. The fountain's rusty basin now brimmed with rainwater. Several statues under collapsing shelters watched him with empty sockets. Their faces, worn down by weather and time, lacked any trace of individuality. Climbing the broad steps to the main doors, he noticed they were flung wide open. That was suspicious. The The building, though seemingly deserted, might attract various visitors. Someone else might already be here searching for hidden knowledge, or leaving the doors open as a trap. He entered quietly, hoping to remain undetected. The entrance hall lay in darkness, with a high ceiling lost above. Painted columns loomed phantom-like, and scraps of old parchment, dusty rags, and broken chairs lay everywhere. Shards of stained glass crunched underfoot, the remnants of grand windows. He paused, letting his eyes adjust to the gloom. Rain cascaded in thin streams through holes in the roof, forming puddles on the floor. Occasionally, a lightning flash outside briefly lit the labyrinth of shelves reaching into the shadows. It was as though the maze of books was wordlessly calling, "Enter and know the secret, or be lost in the depths of your own ignorance." Yet he felt no fear of books, only a wary curiosity of the presence that might lurk here. Listening intently, he caught the faint sound of footsteps deeper within, maybe one person, maybe several. They were trying to move quietly, but the echo betrayed them. He skirted the wall with silent steps, bypassing several staircases leading to a second-floor gallery. Damp boards creaked under his feet. He held his breath to avoid detection, crouching behind broken railings to peer down into the central hall. Below, in what once might have been a reading room, glimmered a pale blue light, a magical lamp orb, confirming that someone else was roaming this abode of knowledge. He scanned the partly ruined area. In the far corners, tall shelves had collapsed into piles of dusty tomes and debris. Some upright shelves remained hidden in darkness. In that glow, he could make out 3 human figures standing by a thick support column that braced the ceiling. They seemed to be deep in conversation or debate. He recognized the tall outline of a woman and 2 men, one slightly hunched. A chill ran down his spine as he recognized the voices. These were the same 3 from the tavern, the broad-shouldered man with a scarred chin, the wiry youth, and the tall woman whose rage had flared so quickly. Their hushed argument might have been about something serious. How did they get here? And why, he wondered. Plainly, they were hunting for something important. Possibly the same ancient lore about the curse that had drawn him here. He was in no rush to introduce himself. First he needed to know their motives. At the tavern, they'd only stopped fighting because of that sacred oath they invoked. Now, the time and place were different, and such an oath might not keep them from seeking power or satisfying personal ambition. So he decided to sneak closer and listen. But as he crept onto a damp section of the balcony, a loose plank creaked. The noise echoed painfully through the library. Instantly, the trio below snapped to attention. The wiry youth, who earlier had seemed the most carefree, whipped out a dagger with lightning speed. The woman jerked her head upward, her eyes shining in the gloom. The broad-shouldered man signaled for silence. They peered up at the gallery. In the orb's pale glow, their faces were as if chiseled from stone, and the shadows behind them seemed alive. "Who's there?" the woman demanded in a low but forceful voice. No one answered. Lightning flickered outside, and for a brief second, the stranger glimpsed them all, tense, weapons at the ready. He decided it was better not to provoke a confrontation. Should he walk down and introduce himself? Given their fighting skill, evidenced by the earlier tavern brawl, that could turn dangerous. So he backed away along the corridor that led to other sections of the library. After all, his aim was to reach the restricted archives where details about the curse-breaking ritual might lie. Perhaps they wanted the same. Whether they'd end up as allies or enemies remained unclear. Retreating silently, he spied a heavy ironclad door. Judging by the carved coat of arms on the stone arch, it might lead to the rare manuscripts section or some other restricted area for privileged scholars. No magical ward was evident, just a rusty bolt. Holding his breath, he raised the latch with a clank that resounded through the building. It was too late to turn back. Once inside, he leaned against the door, willing his heart to slow. This chamber was pitch black, with only faint gold tracery glimmering on the walls, old murals partly peeled away. The air felt stale, reeking of dust and resin, perhaps from wooden crates and scrolls once stored here, soaked in preserving oils. He coaxed a tiny flame to life, dampened behind his palm to keep it dim. Straight away, he noticed something. The floor was riddled with cracks, and at its center yawned a hole leading to a lower level. It appeared the stone had collapsed under centuries of pressure, revealing a dark void. Steering clear of the pit, he made out rows of shelves leaning precariously or partially toppled, forming a bizarre tangle of timbers. Thick dust caked the upper shelves, while a few tomes lay scattered on the floor, suggesting someone had rummaged through them. Carefully, he picked up one. Its cover was faded, the title carved in letters on an archaic script. The first page identified it as a treatise on ancient protective rites, some of which he found partly understandable. Flipping through it, he found nothing immediately useful and set it aside, straining to hear if anyone followed. Faint voices drifted from above. The three from the tavern had apparently discovered his trail. It was time to hurry. Ducking behind a shelf in near-total darkness, he tested the floor's stability. One of the large flagstones wobbled, showing a narrow gap beneath. Possibly it led to an adjacent chamber or the basement. Secret passages like this often existed in such old libraries so that precious manuscripts could be quickly hidden in emergencies. He slipped his knife into the crack and pried the stone up. Beneath lay a low tunnel shored up with half-rotten timbers. The board smelled moldy and damp, but seemed intact enough. Descending, he felt a gust of cold air brush his face. A proper torch would have been ideal, but he had only the pale glow of a small magic orb he summoned with a flick of his fingers. It cast an otherworldly gleam on the tunnel walls. He soon reached a narrow landing strewn with broken shelves entangled in tree roots that had forced their way through the masonry. Amid this chaotic litter he spotted a surprisingly intact cabinet with bronze fittings. Its doors were latched shut, but something inside clinked when he jostled them. Opening it, he found several containers wrapped in cloth. Undoing one, he discovered metal cylinders for scrolls, similar to the earlier ones he had taken. Each bore a stamped label, written in a language he did not recognize. He traced the symbol with a finger, trying to recall if he had seen its like before. A vague memory of a northern monastery rose in his mind. There was no time to decipher it. Above, footsteps closed in. Someone was already in the room he had just left. Likely the tavern trio, given the woman's hissed words echoing downward and the youth's tense reply. Possibly they had forced open the door or broken it down. The man with the heavy tread, surely the scarred warrior, followed close behind, and the stranger overheard the woman, "We are not alone. He's down there." The youth exclaimed, "Look at footprints on the floor." They'd realize he'd headed below. He acted swiftly, grabbing two cylinders from the cabinet and checking they indeed contained scrolls before stuffing them into his bag. He peered down the continuation of the tunnel. Heading deeper was a gamble, there was no telling where it might emerge. On the other hand, trying to slip past an armed, edgy trio was also a gamble. "I'll take my chances," he decided, heading down the tunnel which might end at an old well or a hidden library vault. The passage twisted and turned, the dampness intensifying. Water squelched underfoot, and the air smelled like marshy decay. Soon, he reached a crumbling arch overgrown with moss, a huge root hanging overhead like a snake. Beyond lay a corridor whose walls had deep alcoves once used for storing relics or remains, he couldn't tell. The darkness pressed in, the only sound the steady drip of rainwater through cracks in the stone, plunking into puddles one by one. Suddenly, there was a faint rustling from the left. He swung the glowing orb that way and spotted footprints in the wet floor, fresh enough that the water had not yet washed them away. That meant he wasn't the only recent visitor to these depths. Perhaps some monstrous presence or agents of the crown, or smugglers scouring for relics. He drew his dagger, aware it would do little good against powerful spells or well-armed foes, but it was better than nothing. A little farther on, he emerged into a circular chamber with a soaring vaulted ceiling. At its center was a well enclosed by a metal railing that still bore the remnants of colored enamel. The enamel had largely peeled away, and a portion of the barrier had collapsed. A broken wooden ladder descended into the well, snapping midway. A hollow moan rose from below, like a wind in a tunnel, though there shouldn't be wind that far down. The stranger peered over the edge, shining his orb, illuminating only the slimy stone walls. The bottom was lost in shadow. While he studied it, light steps sounded behind him. Spinning round, the orb revealed a tall figure raising an arm to shield their eyes from the glare. The tavern woman. Behind her crouched the wiry youth, and further back in the half-dark stood the broad-shouldered man. Their weapons gleamed. "Stop," the young man said, voice trembling yet firm. "We don't want a pointless fight, but we won't let you go." The woman squinted at the stranger. "You were in the tavern," she said in a tense voice. "The one who sat with his hood up. What's your name? Why'd you sneak in here?" He didn't rush to answer. Instead, he raised his dagger slightly, showing he intended defense but not aggression. His gaze flicked to the scarred warrior, hunched like a seasoned fighter prepared to spring. The man's stare was fierce but also thoughtful, as if he didn't wish to kill without cause. "Speak," the woman repeated, stepping forward. "We are not looking to repeat the tavern fiasco. But don't imagine you can escape or beat all of us." The stranger realized conflict was inevitable if he kept silent. He decided to offer a careful truth. "I'm looking for knowledge of the curse threatening the city. I know this library might hold the key to rituals that can either break it or make it stronger. And you, why are you here?" He tried to remain calm, with neither fear nor bravado. The possibility existed they too sought to remove the curse or possibly harness it. They exchanged glances. The youth lowered his weapon but didn't sheath it. The scarred warrior growled, "We know something of that curse too. We were sent," he abruptly broke off, having said more than he intended. The woman frowned. "Let's put it this way, it's our concern as well. If we don't find a way to break this evil cycle, thousands could die, especially those we care about." She took another step, the orb's glow revealing her face. Tangled, rain-drenched hair framed the harsh lines and old scars that suggested a life of conflict. The stranger felt conflicted. It seemed their objectives might truly align. But could he trust them? In the tavern, they had almost slain one another until an oath was invoked. Yet sometimes, unraveling an ancient curse requires multiple parties acting together, bound by a temporary alliance. Could they be the ones who possessed the skills he lacked? The ritual might demand specific items or incantations that only someone bound by a blood oath could perform. He decided to take the risk. With a flick of his wrist, he slipped his dagger back into its sheath, indicating a willingness to talk. "All right. Let's say we work together," he said quietly. "But I warn you, if I see you trying to use the curse for selfish ends," the woman smirked. "Calm yourself, stranger. We are no fools. Dabbling in dark powers isn't our plan. We are doing our duty, even if we don't appear very hospitable." The youth, still half-poised with his weapon, added, "For now, we can help each other. Look around, down here, we could corner you easily, but we also can't get to where we need without you." "Why?" the stranger asked warily. "I see you have a magic light and a few artifacts," the youth replied, eyeing the golden ribbon visible under the cloak. "I'd guess you know how to open sealed doors. We need access to the central archives." So the stranger realized the boy was observant. They had probably seen him open the library gates. "All right," he said. "We'll move on together, at least for now. But at least tell me your names." The big man hesitated, so the woman answered curtly, "Emmeline." The youth forced a small grin. "Tyran." Then they both looked at the broad-shouldered fighter, who reluctantly muttered, "Rigel." "And my name," the stranger trailed off, unsure whether to give it. "We'll just call you the Wanderer," Emmeline suggested with an ironic edge in her voice, but also an understanding that each of them had secrets to keep. He nodded. Thus they formed a tenuous pact. Rigel seemed uneasy working with a mysterious figure, but said nothing more. Tyran, restless, forged ahead, as if eager to settle everything swiftly, still stung by guilt over the tavern skirmish. Emmeline kept her cool, staying near the Wanderer, watching him use the magic orb and seemingly testing his skill. She appeared to be gauging whether he posed a threat, or if he genuinely knew what he was doing. They circled the well, not descending it, and headed into a farther corridor that ended at another door. Outside, the downpour raged on, but beneath these ancient vaults reigned a primordial stillness broken only by dripping water. The door was thick oak with corroded iron panels. A faint spiral symbol, resembling the one the Wanderer recognized, was etched into its surface, but with additional spirals suggesting a more intricate seal. "Looks like the same mechanism as the gates," he murmured. "My key might still work." "Then do it," Rigel said curtly, scanning the dark recesses for an ambush. Once more, the Wanderer employed the golden ribbon, winding it around his wrist and pressing his hand to the carving. At first, nothing. But when he uttered a few words in the archaic tongue, a soft click resonated within the wood. The lock began to give way, and that same biting chill, which had burned him at the library gates, rippled up his arm. A glow flickered over the carving, the door shuddered open, unleashing a stale draft that smelled of centuries-old parchment and damp earth. Emmeline wrinkled her nose. Like it's been sealed for ages. Probably has, the wanderer replied, stepping inside. Be on guard. No telling what we'll find. Beyond lay a large chamber that resembled a workshop or laboratory. Along the walls stood long tables cluttered with intricate apparatus, ceramic vessels, and scrolls of various sizes. Ornate columns supporting the ceiling bore carvings depicting the crafting of magical devices or the brewing of potions. Dust, rust, and corrosion covered nearly everything, though someone had recently shifted some items. Books lay scattered as though hastily examined. Could someone else have come through here recently? Turan asked, surveying the turned-over tables. No doubt, Emmeline replied. They are looking for the same thing we are. Rigel nodded at a door across the chamber. It's ajar. Must be they went that way. The wanderer scanned the area for traps, but detected only tension and a sense of unseen presence. A gleam caught his eye on one table, the metal corner of a thick tome. Its worn pages bore drawings of odd mechanisms, reminiscent of a cross between an astrolabe and a compass. The scribbled text was in the same unfamiliar script as on the cylinders, runes that seemed culled from several magical traditions. Might be important, he thought, gently peeling it from its dusty resting place. Wrapping it in cloth, he slipped it into his bag with his other discoveries. The half-open door beyond carried a faint smell of something burning, accompanied by a strange hissing, like steam escaping. A soft glow flickered in that room. Emmeline motioned the others to wait, leaning forward to spy through the gap. Finding no better vantage, she pushed the door open another inch. What she saw made her freeze. In the center of a smaller lab-like space stood a gaunt, nearly skeletal figure in a hooded robe, hunched so low its cowl slipped off its shoulders. Its hands, bony and blackened, moved above a metal vessel containing some churning substance. Sparks of arcane energy crackled around it, warping the surrounding air. Who is that? Turan mouthed silently, craning past Emmeline. The wanderer, stepping up, tried to recall if he'd ever encountered a being like this. Perhaps it was a twisted sorcerer, disfigured by dark arts. Warily, they watched. The figure sealed the vessel and turned sideways, revealing a sunken eye socket, the skin stretched taut over bone. Then, from within the vessel, a tiny glowing orb rose, shooting upward before bursting into glittering sparks. The figure glanced up and muttered something, then waved a hand over the table. A harsh scraping sound followed, and a cluttered cupboard slid aside to expose a hidden compartment. This one knows exactly where to look, the wanderer surmised. Likely searching for the same prize as I and not likely to give it up willingly. At that thought, the robed figure jerked its head as though sensing intruders. Down! Emmeline hissed, and they all dropped, hugging the floor. Instantly, a violent gust of wind rushed from the room, blowing them off their feet, some kind of magical probe meant to root out trespassers. The force was so strong it flung the door wide, sending furniture crashing in a cacophony. Scrambling upright, the wanderer saw the figure approach through the doorway, raising skeletal arms. Its eyes gleamed with malevolence. It seemed the entire curse and all its fury lived within this being. With a roar, Rigel charged, sword swinging, but the blade halted inches from the thing's body, an invisible shield crackled with sparks. Rigel was hurled back, slamming into the wall. Turan hurled a throwing dagger, but it froze mid-flight as if snatched by an invisible grip, then clattered to the floor. The creature sneered, lifting a hand for another strike. Realizing a direct fight was unwinnable, the wanderer activated the golden ribbon, struggling to recall words to disrupt the foul magic. He spoke, clipped and precise, and the ribbon shone with a gentle golden radiance. Immediately, the figure convulsed as though shocked. The malice in its eyes flickered and dimmed, it recoiled, pressing both hands to its face. Emmeline seized the opportunity, she leapt forward, slashing its shoulder with her sword. This time there was no barrier, it howled, staggering back as black fluid spurted out, sizzling foully against the floor. It didn't appear to be normal blood but something laced with dark sorcery. The air shimmered, as though the malignant energy were distorting reality. Breathing raggedly, the creature stared at its wound, seemingly siphoning ambient power to heal. But the wanderer gave it no time. Using the last of the ribbon's glow, he launched a burst of light that flared across the space. With an unearthly wail, the thing's form faded, maybe disintegrating, maybe slipping away. All that remained was a ragged cloak collapsing to the floor, and the metal container it had been working with, still boiling with some toxic substance. They were left in a shaky silence. Turan retrieved his dagger, eyeing the cloak warily. Did it die? Vanish? Emmeline grimaced at the blackened puddle while Rigel dusted himself off, rubbing a bruised shoulder. The wanderer felt unsure whether the creature was truly destroyed or had merely dissolved into smoke, retreating elsewhere to nurse its wounds. It might be tied directly to the curse, he said. We must hurry. If it returns stronger, things will get worse. They entered the small lab, scanning the bizarre apparatus, retorts, flasks, metallic contraptions swirling with bright green fluid. Charts of alchemical machinery hung in tatters. The cupboard the creature had moved concealed an iron-bound door. Clearly, it had tried to open that door when it sensed their approach. Whatever's behind it must be vital, Emmeline said. Shall we see? Rigel leaned his shoulder into the cupboard and, with a loud heave, pushed it aside. Sure enough, a hidden iron hatch stood behind it. Turan ran his fingers over the gap. Sealed from within. Or just rusted. Let me try, said the wanderer, drawing his dagger. He noticed the same spiral symbol in the corner, this time slashed by a diagonal line. Summoning the ribbon's magic again yielded no response, signifying a different kind of seal. We could force it, suggested Rigel. Emmeline tested the hinge, then they tried a lever, but it was immovable. Let's knock off the hinges, Rigel muttered, raising his sword. Just as he readied to swing, a green spark shot off one of the alchemical devices, skittering along the blade like lightning. Rigel cried out, jerking his hand away, a scorch mark seared his palm. Careful! Emmeline shouted, pulling him back. The place was full of charged magical gear, any brute force might trigger a blast. We need a plan, the wanderer said, weighed down by fatigue. Turan suggested, look for a switch or some arcane circuit. Labs like this often have a shutoff for the energy field. So they searched, moving gingerly among the tables. Emmeline spotted a lever on the wall, labeled in a faded dialect. The wanderer deciphered bits, ventilation, protective loop, the rest was illegible. Ventilation? Turan asked, baffled. Might be tied to releasing or neutralizing something, replied the wanderer. He pulled it. Metal clanked behind the walls, followed by a soft hiss. The green sparks hovering over the apparatus faded away. Gears rumbled in a corner, a tiny window near the ceiling creaked open, and the damp night air breezed in. Looks like it worked, Rigel grunted, warily watching the contraptions. Emmeline nodded. Try again. This time, they wedged a blade under the hinges of the iron hatch. Even so, the metal remained stubbornly stuck, until Turan found a small crowbar in a supply chest. Rigel jammed it into the gap, yanking with a grunt until a loud crack signaled the door giving way. It fell to the floor with a clang, revealing a musty passage and a draft of cool air. Let's go, the wanderer said, and one by one they crept through. Down a narrow stairwell they went, the walls still marked by ancient torches. A faint glow, possibly from an enchanted lamp left behind, shone below. Step by step, the chill intensified, until they emerged into a round chamber hewn from solid rock. At its center stood an altar table, scattered with amulets, dusty pages, and a few crystals glowing an internal blue. It seemed some kind of ritual or research space, not unused in recent times. One crystal still smoldered, and fresh candle stubs littered the floor. Among the scattered objects lay half a porcelain mask, broken clean in two. On its brow was etched a horned crescent symbol. The wanderer picked it up, turning it over. That's the mark of the House of the Moon Crescent, Emmeline whispered, her face paling. If they are involved, Turan shuddered, but they were declared wiped out ages ago. Rigel's fists tightened. Apparently not all of them. If so, they may be fueling the curse. They turned to the altar and examined the manuscripts. Much was in unknown script, but on one open page were some recognizable marks. The wanderer traced a line, blood offering, encircled with stones of power, bind with the thread of fate. It was clearly a ritual, though whether it was to break the curse or invoke an even darker power was unclear. We'll need a proper translation, he muttered, gathering the pages to take with them. Emmeline glanced nervously at the crystals. You sense that? They are vibrating. The wanderer nodded. Yes. Feels like a resonance with a great power source. Don't touch them with bare hands or you might end up possessed by destructive energies. Despite the warning, Turan, compelled by curiosity, touched one of the crystals, which flared blindingly, reflecting in his eyes. For an instant, he froze, entranced. Emmeline jerked him away. Don't. You want to be devoured by it. Turan shook his head as if snapping out of a bad dream. I couldn't stop myself. Alarmed, Emmeline exchanged looks with Rigel and the Wanderer. This place could kill us all. We need to seal it or at least contain these crystals. Suddenly, the walls trembled with the same rumbling moan they had heard earlier by the well. The floor shook, dust and gravel fell from the ceiling. Something's happening overhead, Rigel warned. Let's get out. The Wanderer spotted a gilded box on the altar's edge, its lid flipped open. Inside were 2 very old parchments. He snatched them up, feeling a distinct throb in his palms as if the runes recognized him. Likely these were crucial to lifting the curse. Right then, the ceiling cracked. Wind and rain burst through the fissure, accompanied by roaring thunder. The storm outside had escalated and the weakened structure couldn't withstand it. Go! Emmeline shouted, seizing Turan's arm and racing up the stairs, Rigel bringing up the rear. Clutching the parchments under his cloak, the Wanderer followed. If this place caved in entirely, they'd be trapped or killed. Reaching the lab, they found it flooding fast, the underground channels were overfull, letting the deluge surge into the corridors. That door's useless now. Turan cried, pointing to the main entry swamped with rushing water. There must be another exit, shouted the Wanderer, spotting a diagram pinned to a wall. It appeared to show a system of magical conduits, plus part of a floor plan. He saw a note about a stair to the grand atrium and dashed in that direction. They moved through a hallway lined with vials, the water rising visibly. Strange substances from the metal container had spilled out, reeking of rot. Fewer green sparks crackled now, likely the earlier procedure had drained the energy. They reached a broad stairwell as powerful bursts of rain poured through a collapsed roof above. The magic orb flickered in the chaos, but somehow they pressed onward despite slipping steps and lungs burning with exhaustion. They all knew their survival depended on sticking together. Finally emerging into a side hall of the library's upper floor, they realized the storm had reached a violent crescendo. Bolts of lightning had destroyed sections of the roof, allowing torrents of rain to cascade inside, streaming down the pillars. The grand reading room, once awe-inspiring, now resembled a half-ruined cavern about to be swallowed by the tempest. But at least some large windows remained, partially smashed, offering a path to a balcony and from there, presumably, an outside stair. Wading through soaked debris, they got to the windows. Forcing one open, they stepped onto the stone balcony, which swayed alarmingly in the gale. The night sky pulsed with lightning, revealing the city below as a surging river of streets. Torches flickered here and there, while watchfires glowed on far ridges. From the looks of it, the city was fully on alert, perhaps sealing gates and marshalling troops. But normal defenses meant little against ancient magic and supernatural storms. A narrow staircase ran along the exterior. They clung to the crumbling railing as they descended, fully aware a single misstep would be fatal, yet staying under the collapsing roof was riskier still. At one point, a massive statue perched above them cracked away with a thunderous crash, barely missing them before shattering on the cobbles far below. The impact was so forceful it buckled Turan's knees. Rigel caught him just in time, bellowing over the wind, "Hold on, lad." At last, they reached the lower courtyard. The rain-drenched plaza had become a lake, water gushing everywhere, overwhelming the drains. They had to cross it to the gates, then seek shelter in sturdier parts of the city. The Wanderer glanced back once at the library's soaring facade, forlorn beneath the raging sky, like an ancient fortress succumbing to the passage of time. His heart twinged at the thought of centuries of knowledge sinking into oblivion, but there was no choice if they were to survive. At least they had salvaged a few scrolls and books. Slogging across the courtyard, they found to their dismay that the wrought iron gate was once again sealed by that twisting spiral emblem, despite the Wanderer having opened it earlier. "Someone locked it behind us," Emmeline said, her voice tense. The Wanderer pressed the ribboned hand to the design. This time the surge of cold magic was stronger, and the spiral refused to yield. "Try the spell," Turan yelled, shivering in either fear or cold. The Wanderer exhaled, focused, and repeated the formula. Though the ribbon glowed, the seal stayed intact. "It's not working," he murmured hopelessly. The water was nearly waist-high now, the wind whipping any words from their lips. Without waiting, Rigel roared and thrust his sword directly into the center of the iron pattern. Metal squealed as sparks lit the blade. Fisher spiderwebbed across the spiral. Encouraged, he gave a mighty tug on the hilt, and it tore loose a chunk of the gate, leaving a gap big enough to squeeze through. Another lightning bolt stabbed the sky, and Emmeline cried, "Watch out." A stone chunk tumbled from the gate's arch, landing with a colossal splash, but missing them. Summoning their last reserves of strength, they slipped through the jagged opening, scraping themselves on rusty edges. Once on the flooded street, they had no time to rest. They had to reach higher ground and figure out their next move. The Wanderer clutched the ritual scrolls, aware that these precious documents might be the only way to save them all, or, if they fell into the wrong hands, usher in catastrophe. For now, the four of them clung to survival, drenched and chilled to the bone, battered by wounds and bruises. Overhead, thunder crashed like an omen of an imminent clash of arcane powers that had stirred in the darkness for ages. A wave of weariness threatened to wash over him, but he gripped the scrolls tighter and remembered why he had come, to sever the ancient chain of evil strangling the land, to prevent the kingdom from being consumed by the dark. They pressed on, wading through the thigh-deep current. Rounding a bend, they glimpsed the heavy walls of the noble quarter, and, farther up, the palace towers glowing fitfully in the lightning's glare. The sky churned with black clouds, pouring its endless fury onto the city below. The night bristled with peril. Yet the Wanderer was no longer alone. Three unlikely companions, bound by a mysterious oath, were now at his side. Where their path would lead remained to be seen, once the storm subsided and dawn revealed the city, scarred by one of the fiercest nights in its history. For now, they fought through torrents of rain and the debris of broken hopes, in search of a final chance at salvation.